Call the meeting to order. Are we doing a regular pledge allegiance and all that? Okay. Please rise for the pledge allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, Jill. Jill?
Frank Carini,
Here.
Cheryl Siniglia,
Here.
Leah Schreiber-Johnson,
Here.
Amy Malat,
Here.
Darren Gabowski, Jane Eichhoff,
Here.
Mark Verhalen.
Here.
Can't hear you.
All right, everybody. Hi, welcome to
There we
our
go.
work study. Okay, now everybody can hear me. So this is a different sort of meeting. It's a little weird compared to what we normally have, right? So we're here in the staff professional development room at district office. Everybody's got their sweetheart table, like at a wedding, right? How we've become accustomed to doing our meetings lately. Normally, the work study is a discussion. Right, it doesn't have some of the same elements that a normal board meeting has. The different Robert rules of pieces that you become accustomed to, votes, etc. It's like our discussion piece. So what we have kind of planned here for tonight is I'm going to preview some of the discussions and some of the future messages that will be coming. I'm going to sum up some of the stuff that's been done to date. We're going to talk about some early FAQ elements that we've been working through so far. But I thought I would just start by sharing the first couple of paragraphs of the executive summary that I've prepared for the community that I'm going to share with folks after this meeting concludes, right? So we might be here talking for a while, but what I've done is go through these PowerPoint slides and some of the prior communications we've had to date and put together like a thoughtful summation of this material so we can send it out right after this meeting, right? So let me start by saying, this is the precursor to the letter that we'll be sending out this evening. So this evening, I had the opportunity to have a thoughtful discussion with our Board of Education. That's what we're about to have right now, previewing our responsible return to school plan for fall. We're sending this message, and I'm summing up a little bit, because our philosophy all along has been to share consistently, thoughtfully, and in a timely way. Okay, this message is not the final word on fall. Right, let me be very clear. This message is not the final word on fall. We all want certainty, but the one thing that we are certain of is that there will be more change. Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about surveys, communications to date, as well as tentative plans we've been sharing and messages we're preparing in the days leading up to the first days of the 2021 school year. So there's new content here, right? But all along, and today as well, we continue to methodically share pieces of information that we know full well may need to be revised right up to the first days of school. Okay. I quote myself from an earlier message, which I don't usually do, but I said a few weeks ago, I wrote, given the possibility that we could face imminent closure of our sites or individual quarantines of our kids, if you can, and we realize this may not be possible for everyone, we encourage families to consider tentative, temporary plans in the event of intermittent closures or quarantine. So that was one of my earliest messages that was in there. So I put that in there again. That statement remains as true today as when it was written. And we know that beyond what is covered on the local and national news, our own health department continues to share that cases in our community are growing and that quarantines have been ordered in both our youth and summer programs, right? And that means that the potential exists for your elementary schooler to be in session while your high schooler may be home for a period of time, or vice versa. I think it's important that we be very clear about those potentialities, right? As we prepare to return to school, we continue to plan and prepare as thoughtfully and diligently as we can, responding to the latest information and rightfully expending a great deal of time and effort on all the different challenges and scenarios we will surely face come September. What follows is a summary of the board's discussion tonight. Some of this information is redundant from prior messages, some is new, some previews messages slated for the days to come. So like I said, an executive summary of the presentation we've prepared for you tonight, so people have a good sense of what occurred in this meeting and what we've laid out at this moment in time on July 20th. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, good. So that said, I'm going to set this aside. It's a couple page document, right? It's much easier to digest than, I don't know, I thought we could be here 2 hours maybe talking about all this stuff, right? So we wanted information at people's fingertips, even though that's different than how we normally conduct a board work study. Usually we're here, we're talking, we're collaborating, but I thought it was very important that we get information in people's hands immediately post this meeting, right? So summary of all these slides to come. Up on the screen in front of you, you see slide number 1 of our responsible return to school plan as it stands for July 20th. Okay, so I'm going to take the bulk of these slides and work through them. You'll hear from Assistant Superintendent Kuterik and Director of Curriculum and Assessment, John Krennick, for a little while, but mostly it'll be me talking through these. And what I'd like to do is work my way through these slides. I've had a number of you mention that before, so we can digest this thing. And then what I also have is a number of questions that we've accumulated already that I thought I could ease into, like some of our conversation, by going through some of these, because the other piece of the communication that we're planning to send out is the beginning of a community FAQ. Right, so 20 or so questions that are on people's minds, a button on the website to submit more, so we can build this as we go along, right? Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation where the questions continue to accumulate. People won't have the information they need at their fingertips. So format-wise, an executive summary of what I'm going to present, which I already shared with you. We're going to work our way through these slides, trading between a couple of us in this room. Then I'll work through some of the questions that have been submitted already, that we have ready to go for the website, and then we can all just talk like we normally do at a board work study. So does that sound okay with everybody for format wise?
Sounds great.
Okay.
If I could just ask if everybody mutes themselves when they're not talking, though, there's a lot of background noise that's happening.
Good point.
Thank you.
Here we go. All right. Okay. So to begin, kind of as a primer here, these are the related communications that we've done to date, and this previews approximate dates for subsequent messages we're planning in the days to come. Okay, so on June 16th, our family survey went out. This was a reaction to the emergency virtual learning, right? And I have some more slides on this, but that was kind of your first, okay, the year's concluded, give us your feedback based on your experience. It was voluminous, and I've mentioned that before. On June 23rd, we put out a family survey relating to a return to school. Now, I allude to this later on because that survey closed on July 6th, if my memory serves me correctly. So July 6th feels like an eternity ago, right? So things are changing, situations evolving. We very likely will have to survey again to get an accurate read on numbers. And I'll say more about that in a little while. On July 1st, our community message regarding DPI guidance and summer planning came out. This is a first big burst of information. And I'll say this too, all of these communications have been linked on the COVID tab of our website. So if anyone ever wants to look back and like read the story of this in communications, they're all like nested below one another with the most recent communication at the top of the website, and the tab for the FAQ, and the tab for submitting more questions. So on July 8th, our community message regarding transportation went out. On July 15th, community message regarding cleaning protocols went out. And you all know this, but most of these, if not all of them, have an accompanying staff companion message that go with them. So today is our board work study, and later on this evening, a family message regarding fall. The executive summary of this meeting goes up. Okay. On July 29th, a community message regarding contingency for remote learning. You'll see some of this previewed this evening, but it's only on like one slide, accompanied by a little bit of discussion from me. But that July 29th communication or thereabouts is very important because that builds heavily on the June 16th family survey information. So that's when the team shares, here are some critical lessons we learned from emergency virtual learning that occurred back in the spring, right? And here's what we're going to do to make it better should we find ourselves in that situation again come fall or throughout the year, right? So that's a key communication that helps communicate to people how we're going to do better. And we're going to touch on that a little bit tonight. I would say that largely our community was very understanding of the crisis we were thrown into, but there's many improvements that could have been made on what happened in the spring. And I think our staff stands ready to make those improvements. So August 5th or thereabout, a community message regarding a virtual program for students and families with underlying health conditions. But like I said before, there's odds are going to have to be some other communications that come prior to that, so we get a better sense of current numbers as of this day, right? Like there's a point when other plans need to be made when groups become so large that this is not a manageable number for us. And that's an important thing for us to think about. August 12th, community message regarding health protocols. This is pretty extensive. This answers a lot of questions about, there are a lot of questions that people have raised about what are the contingencies we're going to operate under in the event that there's COVID, health room concerns, home screening, all kinds of stuff of that nature. That's a pretty big burst of info too. And then the duration of August tentatively leaves room for principal messages to students, families, sharing school-specific information. So kind of like in a normal year, you hear a lot of voice of the principal stuff start to come through right around August, right? This office puts out something that's your annual welcome to school message. It's just, this is such a strange summer that there's probably even more messaging here this summer than any summer I can ever recall in my time. So it's just a lot happening here, but this is broad strokes, right? These, I imagine there'll be other supplemental pieces that accompany these, but these are core elements that we know have to go, and this is the general time frame for them. Make sense? Okay. So a little bit of what is in the slides that follow in the responsible return to school plan. I'll talk at length about instructional programming, infection control and mitigation measures. Some of this has been previewed already in prior communications. School operations and student services are sections of this presentation as well that we'll hit on. And like I said, there's a bunch of redundant information in here from prior communications. I've said to folks I've talked to on the phone or people I've emailed with that we're not dropping bombshells tonight, right? It's a chunk of what we've said already. It's what we've said we're going to share more about in the future and alluding to what's to come, all with the idea in the background that much of this could change at a moment's notice, and we have to monitor current situation very closely. So key elements guiding our plan for a responsible return to school: the family and staff feedback surveys, which, like I said, may very well need to expand. Some notes on virtual learning from spring, family, students, and educators. Expectations for the fall from our families, a staff survey, Department of Public Instruction and Health Services recommendations, and guidance from the Oak Creek Health Department. Also, the American Association of Pediatrics and a number of other authorities in the area. This is just to name a few. So our plan phases, and I'm going to slow down a little bit here. This is an important slide. Like I've shared in prior communications that we talked about, in-person, face-to-face learning is an important phase that we've been preparing for, and a lot of our communications have focused on. The functional definition for this for us is all students in school, safety and disinfection guidelines in place, stay safe to stay open. You saw those exact words in prior communications, right? Another phase of preparation is temporary remote learning. So should we be ordered closed, the pivot to remote learning for individual or groups of students for as long as is required. And there on the side, and I represented it that way to kind of make the point that this is occurring regardless of which other phase people may be in. That's a 100% virtual learning plan for our early estimated approximately 4% of students and families with underlying health conditions. But like I said at the outset, we expect that this number has increased in recent days. This was from our survey that closed on July 6th. So you all know this as well as I do. There are a great deal of varying family viewpoints on this subject, right? Everything from open schools without restrictions to remain closed until a vaccine is deployed, and everything in between. This is the open-ended comment portion of the survey I was talking about before, which I've said already was voluminous. Like everything you could think of, every possible perspective you can imagine is represented. There is wide differences of opinion on this subject, or there certainly was as of July 6th when that survey closed. So I noted the American Academy of Pediatrics just because this quote here has been widely circulated in a lot of different places. They'd recommended students physically attend school. Children need to be physically present in schools for mental, social, and academic health. They note there is a preponderance of evidence that children are less likely to be symptomatic and less likely to have severe disease and maybe less likely to spread infection. You've no doubt seen a lot of information since the release of this quote, other studies that expand on it, other studies that in a sense contradict some of these positions. So it isn't as cut and dry as it appears on its face. There's a lot to this, but that American Academy of Pediatrics website's seen a lot of traffic, and that quote has been widely circulated, and I shared it, element of it in a prior communication. So to stay open, we need to continue planning for multiple scenarios and responding to the latest information. We have to put mitigation measures in place to limit the spread, protect our students, families, and our staff. On that, I think everybody can agree, right? You want to open the doors, you got to do those things. So this is the slide that I've referenced in a couple of communications regarding our families' positions on our return to school and other elements here, the one that closed earlier in July. That unsure at this time is an interesting data point, I think. I do not have strong concerns about sending my child back to school in the fall. There it stood at 31%. You can read the text of the question, and up at the top, I will not send my child or children back to school until there's a vaccine. People will also have a greater sense of what we're able to put into place at this point, given all the communication we've been able to do to date. Plus the executive summary of this meeting that comes out, it's a lot more context that people will have tomorrow versus when they finish taking this survey. That's why I put this on here, because this is a snapshot in time. I think we'll likely need another snapshot in time. What health guidelines are most important to you from that same survey? At that point in time, hand washing or hand sanitization availability, enhanced cleaning procedures. So you notice those two elements featured prominently in prior communications, right? You see the minimum social distancing standards, daily home or school illness screenings, mask recommendations, and large gathering limits. Not insignificant totals attached to those items either, right? So I look at this and I see everything matters to people, right? A couple things jump out at you, but everything's important. That's why a lot of what we've shared or that we're planning to share addresses each of these elements. You can't leave something out just because only 1,700 people thought it was really important versus 3,100 people, right? So but it's a good metric for us to look at. From our staff, given what we currently know about the COVID-19 pandemic, please indicate how each practice would affect your comfort level when returning to the building in the fall, right? We see hand sanitization stations at each entry and classroom for students and staff, right? Students and staff regularly washing their hands, also very important to the staff. Visitor elements, daily self-administered temperature screening for all employees, disinfecting procedures, the face covering issue. So if I look at this, I have a similar response to the prior slide. Like some things obviously jump out, but everything on that slide is important to people, right? And given the conversations I've had and the communications that have been shared with all of you, right, this is a snapshot in time and likely looks different today than it did when this was given. Right. But at this moment, like here it is, a lot of very important things that people are weighing heavily right now. I entitled this one Staff Dedicated and Working Together. Like, we asked people a very difficult question at a very difficult time with very limited context, right? We asked people to respond to a question about returning to work before they knew what the plan entailed, before they knew what we'd be able to put in place. There was a lot of trust that people had to have in this organization to answer this question, right? So the things that people were wrestling with at this moment in time were childcare concerns, right? You see the pie chart Pac-Man up there in the upper right. I do not have childcare concerns that impact my ability to return to work. That's the dark orange. And the light orange, I'm unsure at this time. So at that moment in time, almost 23% of our staff had concerns about childcare that they were willing to share with us at that moment. The health and safety pie to the lower left, right? I'm unwilling to return to work based on the criteria described above. We had about 19 people, if my memory serves me correctly, indicate at that time that they needed to have that conversation. So we were able to methodically work with those people who shared that information with us at that moment to figure out the way forward for them. And in almost every case, there was a way forward at that moment, given that limited amount of information that we had. Right. So on that day, that's what it looked like. So there were no doubt some people who chose not to complete the survey, right? And there's no doubt people whose opinions have changed since this survey went out. So the next handful of slides pivot to instructional programming, where we'll talk in greater length about in-person, face-to-face learning, temporary remote learning, and 100% virtual learning for students and families with underlying health concerns. Okay. All right, so some operational definitions. Give me 1 second to toggle screens here. Okay, so like I've said before, the in-person instructional program at this point on this day remains students attending in person 5 days a week. Temporary remote learning, what does that mean? When individual classrooms, grades, or schools are required to close. Why? Temporary closure, quarantine students, or ordered closure. Then pivot to remote learning for individual classrooms, grades, or schools. And virtual learning. So we're at this time exploring a third-party vendor to serve students and families who are not able to return to school due to underlying health concerns. But it's critical that we get accurate numbers, right, and understand who, right, does this program make sense for, and how many individuals does it make sense for as we move forward. Right? Like if it's a third-party vendor organization, that makes a lot of sense for a limited number of students, and it comes at a cost, right? But if the pool is very large, it ceases to make sense in the same sort of way, and we might have to investigate alternative plans, right? But this is the most current information we have about said program at this moment. Okay. I'm going to ask Mr. Krennick to take the next couple of slides here. You see John in the back of the room over there, and he's going to weigh in and talk with us for a second here. Give me a chance to catch my breath.
Thank you, Dan. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Okay. So when we are back in person, we will focus on grade level learning requirements, just like we would in any start of the school year. We will be using formative assessments and observations with students to identify any opportunity gaps that exist from the previous school year. If there are gaps, we will intervene with those gaps to ensure students are proficient in the areas that they may have a gap. We will, how will we do this? We will spiral and scaffold previous learning requirements into on grade level instruction. So for example, if I'm a third grade student or a third grade teacher, I would implement my math learning requirements or my literacy learning requirements, do a pre-assessment on the particular lesson or skill that students need to know. And if I've identified that there are students or a number of students who need to go back to a second grade learning requirement, I can bring that into that particular lesson and build on those skills with that particular student or students. We also want to be really cognizant of limiting a lot of passing time. So art library, and music will be held in the classroom. Gym will still remain in, our physical education will remain in the gym class with limited equipment. Obviously, we've got to be very careful in what equipment's being used, who's handling the equipment, how is the equipment going to be cleaned. And we do have a plan, and we're continuing to plan for that. With middle school, it's a little bit similar to elementary, is that we're going to try to keep our houses in cohorts, so keeping students together as much as possible. And I can give one example of that. So for example, instead of having an every other day Phy-Ed class or world language class, we would have X amount of days, 26, 27 days of the same class, so that we're not transmitting every other day. And that what that does is it takes 180 students and condenses it down to 90 students. So it limits the number of students an educator is seeing, and also limits if we have to do contact tracing back to those 90 students versus 180. Next slide, please. So if we have to pivot to temporary remote learning, I just want to highlight some of the improvements that we've made and what we learned from the staff survey, parent survey, and even student survey. We will continue to use Seesaw for K through 2. In the spring, in March through June, we use Seesaw for K through 5th grade. Our upper elementary students through high school, we're very confident Google Classroom would be the most appropriate platform to use. For younger students, 4K through 2nd grade, Seesaw would be age appropriate to deploy lessons and teach virtually online. We will have live and recorded lessons. So synchronous learning is where it's happening in real time, where the educator is presenting a lesson, math, literacy, science, social studies, in real time. They post, they're going to have schedules. They will post when that math lesson takes place, when that literacy lesson takes place. They will be teaching that lesson. It'll be recorded and then posted when that lesson is done. We do know that not every single student is going to be able to attend a live lesson. Therefore, it will be recorded and posted. And also, if a student or family wants to go back and review the lesson, that will be available. Asynchronous learning is where a lesson may be recorded previously and can be viewed at different times. So I might talk about a social studies project or a science experiment, pre-record it, have students view it, and then have a meeting with my students or groups of students to discuss the project or discuss the science experiment. That's just a very simplistic example of asynchronous learning. As I said, educators will have a robust and consistent daily, weekly schedule that will have office hours, not only for students, but as well as parents. We will also have synchronous individual and small group meetings. So if I'm doing a literacy lesson or a math lesson, students are able to ask questions in real time. I think that will be a great improvement. And from what parents have provided for feedback, that was one area that they hit very, very heavily, that they would hope that if the lessons can be taught, it's taught live. And then again, I mentioned this earlier, is that we will have office hours support both students and families. And not just academically, but social and emotional as well. We know that when students come back, they're coming back with a lot of different backgrounds. They've been off for almost 6 months. We will be building in social and emotional learning right off the bat. Also, if we have to pivot to remote learning, we will be implementing lessons on how to be an online learner right off the bat. It's much different to learn in the classroom than it is to learn online. For example, we would need to teach them, management skills, time management, the different tools that are available to them, and how to use them and implement them for online remote learning. Next slide, please. And then we have, for our learning platforms, one of the areas for improvement that we will be implementing is having a consistent Google Classroom format. If I'm a high school student, I may have had 5 or 6, maybe even 7 different Google Classroom classrooms that I had to follow, and it was very challenging for students and parents to follow and toggle back and forth through all the different variations of Google Classroom. So in the fall, we will have one consistent template for all educators 3 through 12 to follow. So if you have a child in the high school, middle school, or middle school elementary, or high school elementary, that format of Google Classroom will look very similar as far as the template goes. And we will be providing a lot of professional development in the very near future on how to do that. Our IT department, along with the curriculum department, will be working together to develop the professional development modules for educators.
John makes a good point that I'm going to interject on while he's on this slide here. Like, there's under each of these words on this slide or the prior slide, if you start digging, right, there's a million questions, right? Like, how will this be conducted in a home? What does this feel like for an educator? Where are the places where our educators are going to be essential in figuring out how to do this, implement it, plan for it, operationalize this in classrooms and buildings, right? There's each one of these tunnels down, right? Like what John's doing here, what I think is important is he's hitting these high notes for all of us. And we're going to get there in a few minutes, but likely virtually all of our professional development, right, that we're going to have to do this year is going to have to focus on these elements. And the communication that comes along with each one of these pieces is voluminous. And the collaboration that's going to have to occur at each school, right, is significant. Right. So they're bullet points, but each of these represents like a scale of communication, a scale of collaboration, a scale of professional development. And it takes us away from what we would do in a normal year in terms of professional development, in terms of school improvement planning. But it's so vital, right, what we're facing, that this pretty much is the only option for how we spend the few minutes that we do have, right, getting ready. Right. So keep going, John.
Thank you. The middle category, equitable access to grade level learning requirements. I had mentioned that earlier, is that we're really going to focus and scale back our school improvement plans. The school improvement goal for both literacy and math will be to implement on-level grade learning requirements. And that's really, really important, because if we have students coming into a specific grade level, we know that there were skills or concepts that may have been missed the previous year. But if we try to go back and reteach those skills and concepts, what's going to happen when we get to the end of this upcoming school year? We're going to have missed the current on grade level learning requirements. And we can creatively and strategically scaffold in previous learning grade level requirements when and where needed. Not all students are going to have to go back and revisit some of their previous learning requirements. Some students will actually may be up to the next grade level learning requirements. So we will be focused on our on-level grade level learning requirements through observations, pre-assessments, and then really the curriculum's team's work right now is really focusing what are the essential learning requirements that they have to know from the previous grade level, the current grade level, and then moving on to the next grade level. And then remote learning expectations, the last category. As Dan alluded to, we will be spending a tremendous amount of time on our professional development plan, getting educators ready for on-learning or remote learning between now and the end of August. We have modules that we're working on and creating. It's kind of asynchronous, where it's not going to be all at once. It's going to be educators looking at the modules, going through them. Some of them already are proficient with Google Classroom, others not so much, but that's okay. We have to meet every educator where they're at and where their comfort level is and build them up.
So in a normal year, right? And I think back to my time in the classroom, right? You have this incredible opportunity, right, as a teacher to reset for the next year, right? And professional development in those days prior to the start of school, it's like a wave all of a sudden there at the end of August, right? You're doing things, you're working, you're preparing for the year, but then all of a sudden you're back in this new environment, like very intense days of professional development leading up to the year. And we talk about how many hours we spend on X, Y, and Z every single year. So what John's, I'll just to expand on what John's saying is, like, the way we've done professional development historically, it's a lot of people gathered together in big rooms to work on projects and tasks, to work on school improvement plans, right? This isn't the year for that, right? This is a year for a different model, right? So what John's talking about is we have a finite amount of professional development we do annually, right? But who's to say it all has to occur in those handful of days in big rooms with everybody together right before school starts, especially if so much of this work can be constructed in thoughtful modules that people can engage with on their own time, at their own home, at their own pace, right now, right? Which addresses some folks who'd love to start getting into this today, as opposed to waiting till deep into August and having to digest large amounts of information in a real short amount of time, right? So one thing we'd like to do is, instead of like pushing all of our professional development into those couple of days right before school starts, we'd rather build it out and start sharing it now, right? And giving people the opportunity to engage earlier than normal if they can, so we can get a head start on the year. Kind of makes sense? Okay. So I told Mr. Bennon I need one slide on technology that could express the totality of the work the department did and the preparation they're undergoing, right? You all know Chris, he could have given us 40 slides, right? So I said I will do my very best to work through these. So important elements from our IT department, right? Equitable access to technology. And I know many of you are aware of this, but I'm going to go through it again. I just want to highlight the efforts of our IT team, right? Using their vans to deliver equipment all over the community, right? A more selfless group of people you will never find, right? Managing the IT center over here throughout the shutdown in the spring, right? We had to figure out how to, instead of having one-to-one devices distributed throughout our entire district, often housed in certain classrooms, we had to figure out how to get in people's hands and get it home, right? You all know this story, right? But we're going to have to make sure we're in a position to continue to maintain this equipment, to redeploy new equipment, and to make sure we have one-to-one device saturation for K through 12. Chromebooks through K through 12, and iPads in 4K. Right. So that is going to occur. The IT department has a plan for that. I told Mr. Bennon that this stuff all needs to be ready to go like right away, just in case. Like, we have to be prepared right away. 100% home internet access is essential for these contingency plans to work. Our district purchased a number of wireless hotspots. Their IT team diligently worked to deploy. People were coming in and picking them up. And that's something we have to continue to be able to support. Otherwise, a lot of this stuff just doesn't work. If you are in a home that doesn't have Wi-Fi, how do you engage with this stuff? Okay. All staff assign laptops and document cameras to allow for the asynchronous and synchronous teaching from home when necessary, if necessary. Right. And a technology service center moved to district office when we have to flip the switch, if we have to flip the switch. So the old boardroom from a number of years ago that we used in prior days turns into the technology center. Right.
What's the address here, Joe?
Okay. Some lessons we learned from summer. Right. Everybody in this room knows that we were able to learn a lot through the summer sports offerings, through the programs that Heather runs throughout our district. So what did we learn, right? We learned that mitigation measures, once put into place, are well accepted by students and staff, right? We learned that people have become infected with COVID, right? We cannot avoid the elephant in the room. Like, this has happened, it will happen. Right? Students quarantined were able to continue, right, in a lot of cases, and excellent communication exists between our health department and our school district, which is going to be very important for contact tracing should we open our doors come fall. I can share that I spoke to the health department today, as did members of the team that are in this room, and that is not unusual to have daily communication with the health department. So we learned something, as well we should have. infection control and mitigation measures. So there's a bit of review here, and there's a bit of us alluding to future communications. To open and stay open, right? Cleaning and disinfecting is critical. Office and health room management becomes very important. Physical distancing is critical. Limiting infectious spread and personal protective equipment, right? I'm going to hit these in this next section here. Assistant Superintendent Katark is going to weigh in too along the way. Okay, cleaning and disinfecting measures. These items here are reviews from our prior communication that went out from the Building and Grounds Department. So all areas of the school will be disinfected daily following its final use for the day. Classrooms, so desks, tables, bookcases, other hard surfaces, the building, surfaces of lockers, lunch tables, drinking fountains, handrails, doorknobs, right? This is copy and pasted from the message that I sent to the community a couple of days back. We have an extraordinary buildings and grounds team in this district, as you well know, right? I had to ask really hard questions like, what do we have the capacity to do? Are we in a situation where we would have had to press a little bit harder on the DPI plan that was 4 days in and 1 day out, that 1 day accounting for a lot of these elements? Or are we able to use our first, second, and third shifts and our contracted services to do this, right? So Steve, Andy, myself put a bunch of this stuff together, and this is what they shared a few days back. So throughout the school day, the custodial staff will focus on disinfecting high-touch areas throughout the building, like doorknobs, water fountains, handrails. Other locations is determined by the custodian and building staff, like some site-based decisions on what's high traffic, what's high touch, what needs to get cleaned 6 to 8 times a day in some cases. Hand sanitizing stations located throughout schools in high foot traffic areas, classrooms, cafeterias, gyms, libraries, offices. Some of you might have seen some of the large base stations in those inner doors of the high school when we were there for graduation a couple of days ago. Large units, small units, mobile units, mounting units, a bunch of different ways to do this. Classroom disinfectant. Classrooms will be equipped with disinfectant that can be applied throughout the day when kids aren't present, and we have to train people on how to use these things, right? So if a staff member asks, I need something, I need to know how to use it, right? If we're in session, that has to be available for them. And like I said, this was in that prior communication. Health room protocols. Assistant Superintendent Katark is going to weigh in. And again, I'm going to take a drink of water, and she's going to take a couple of slides here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dan. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay, perfect. Thanks. So as Dan previewed, not all of this information has been received by you or the community yet. So this is an example of one of our areas that will be in a forthcoming communication in August. So we just wanted to highlight for you some of the health protocols that will be in place. Throughout the course of designing these recommendations, we have been working closely with the health department and also along the way getting feedback from our building principals, because we want to make sure not only is it a safe recommendation, but also is it practical for implementation at the school. So we are recommending that medication administration continues to occur in the health room, in the office, and mainly that's because that's where we already have locked boxes for medication. So we felt, and our building principals felt, that that was something to not change, but to continue to administer daily medications from the health room. Then we will work with building principals to identify an isolated space, potentially an isolated room, depending on the building, that children and staff who present with influenza-like symptoms or COVID-19-like symptoms can be isolated and put in that safe space, with building principals notifying parents right away of their child presenting with some symptoms and having them come to receive the child and take them home. So we wanted to make sure each building had that isolated space to tend to children presenting with those unique needs. We're going to ask also that classroom teachers work a little bit more closely with staff with students on day-to-day minor injuries. So we're going to make sure our classrooms are more equipped with more Band-Aids, ice packs, so that as kids maybe have a skin knee at recess, maybe just have a bruise, that we can attend to those needs right in the classroom, all to prevent that congestion and traffic in the main office. So we know our school offices are the hub of the building, and they receive a lot of visitors, a lot of staff and students. So in order to kind of minimize those contacts throughout the day, we're going to really try to reduce those contacts between staff and student and that traffic. Under physical distancing measures, these are just a few examples of things that we're working together with our principals on to, again, ensure there's as minimal contact between students and staff as possible. So at the buildings, we're working to keep children in cohorts of students. So that's keeping at the elementary level kids just with their homeroom class. They will have recess together and remain with that group of students, and really reducing that commingling across grades and classrooms. Many of our principals are looking at their entry and exit practices, so really carefully looking at what doors kids are going to enter through and which doors they're going to exit out of, just to minimize congestion and spread kids out as much as possible. Our building principals have also been working closely with us on their lunch schedules and locations, again, all in efforts to keep children just with their classrooms and having as few contacts as possible.
You see that there's stuff that has to be worked through here, and it's going to require deep partnership with the staff as well, right? So earlier in this presentation, I said there's a lot of content here, but the principals are going to be reaching out to their staff to work some of these in a deeper way, to dig down a little bit further to see what's feasible and practical at each given site. So in the broad strokes, these are the concepts, but the final details on this are going to have to be collaboratively designed at sites, right? So thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's great. And then we're ready for the next slide. So another important piece will be limiting asymptomatic and symptomatic spread. And really, in my opinion, this is really rooted in deep, open and frequent communication with our families, kind of under that concept of working together. At school, we will not be conducting screenings of students, so we're going to ask that parents complete home screenings of their children on a daily basis. And it's very similar to what many of us are encountering now as we engage with different businesses in the communities, really asking parents to check in with their children every day to ensure that there's no fever, that there's no sore throat and chills, and ask themselves those questions. And if their child is sick or experiencing any of those symptoms, we're going to want them to keep them home. We're also going to want to encourage parents to have very open communication with us, reporting symptoms when they report a student absent, to the degree to which they're comfortable sharing the information about symptoms and any potential exposure to COVID-19 as well. The notification of confirmed cases. So this is going to be a really key point of conversation with our families to make sure we're all on the same page about how this protocol will happen. So as we've worked with the Oak Creek Health Department, they've shared with us that they will be the ones communicating to families should their child have come in close contact with a positive case of COVID-19. And a close contact is defined with having spent 15 or more cumulative minutes within 6 feet of a confirmed case. And so only if your child would meet or a child would meet that definition would they receive notification from Oak Creek Health Department on confirmed cases. So again, this is going to be another area we're going to have continued conversation and communication with families so that we're all on the same page about how that notification and sharing of information is going to happen. And as we connected with Oak Creek Health Department today, we confirmed that that might change throughout the course of our school year, throughout the beginning of the school year, depending upon volume and numbers of cases in a school or the community. So that will be information and a process that continues to be fluid, but that we will continue to communicate with families on.
So this is new content, right? This hasn't been communicated to the world in a 2-page letter all laid out. This is something we would work through with the health department, and I believe in early August we've slated these to come out in much greater detail, right? So this is the portion of the content here that, like I said before, there's some new stuff in here, but nothing we haven't alluded to before, nothing that doesn't have to be very thoroughly and thoughtfully and collaboratively designed and communicated with our families, right? Another piece here, personal protective equipment, like there's various different face coverings that are recommended or considered appropriate for different groups. district has secured thousands of such face coverings through different state initiatives or things that we've reached out and purchased on our own, right? So if you work with certain students, a traditional mask might not be appropriate for you. You might need a face shield or something clear. If you're a front office administrative assistant, right? Some places have invested in plexiglass, but if you've ever been in an elementary office, you see people moving around constantly, right? Not just in a 3-foot spot right in front of you. They're all over the place. So maybe that's somebody that wears something different, like a face shield or something of that nature. So we purchased these items in the inevitable circumstances where we're going to need them, right? And students and staff, we're likely going to have to talk more at greater length about face coverings, right? This has been a hot topic issue in our community and something people have dug in their heels hard on both sides, right? So there's definitely more we're going to have to talk about in this area. You know that when we put out our transportation communication, the words strongly encouraged were used, right? And we've shared some other stuff where that's the language we've elected to use, right? We're the board to decide to amend our dress code, right? That's something we could collectively do, right? And something we might have to talk about further and venture down that road. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about transportation, which we already have. This is a review of prior communications and some daily logistics and operations, a little bit about special education and social and emotional supports. So these are new items that haven't had voluminous communications of their own already. So just like we talked about some of the health considerations, this is some of the new content you haven't seen already after some stuff you've already talked about. So like I said before, these are the elements from our transportation plan that have already been shared. There's no doubt more challenges here, especially related to staffing, right? All of you know who drives our buses in this community, and it's a lot of retired folks or drivers for Right Way, right? We've had a lot of questions about what will we do if we're short drivers, and we're in continuous contact with Right Way to talk about that too. That's one of those issues that's not settled here on July 20th, and I do anticipate that being a problem we have to work through going forward. I can tell you this too. There's been some communication to us from Right Way regarding their drivers and the strongly encouraged language versus the required language that we could choose to venture down that road and talk about as a board and as a team. So that said, there's a couple of things on this slide that our schools and our principals are going to continue working on. And when I say schools, I mean school community of staff. So how's breakfast and lunch work? What does recess look like? Entry and exit, the annual school traditions and practices like open house, parent-teacher conferences. The list goes on and on. Like we're going to have to really rely on our schools to navigate through some of these questions, right? As a site-based team, BLTs beginning to be engaged by principals tomorrow. That's the plan. And as a district and a school board, these are some things that fall to us, like our choices regarding attendance policies and practices, right? Through board action, we have to work through how we handle attendance, right? We put a high mark on attendance in this district. Most districts do, but we also don't want to have practices that encourage people to attend when they may not feel 100% like themselves. So that's something we'll work through as a team. Student arrival and dismissal times, like if we have to make changes based on transportation, getting into the building, getting situated, we'll have to talk about that as a team, right? Those are not decisions we're going to make unilaterally without board action. Visitors and volunteers, were we to amend our visitor and volunteer policies, those are things we would do as a team. And finally, if we want to get into the dress code regarding face coverings, that's work for us to do at other meetings.
Okay. On special education, Dr. Genderman and I wanted to be sure that we touch base on this a little bit tonight with you and then following up with parents later in the summer. We really wanted to reassure our parents of children with disabilities in the school district that no matter what return to school looks like for us as a whole district or for their individual child, that we're really working to ensure that they receive high quality special education services. And this includes Dr. Genneman working with our special ed team to develop processes to look back on the school closure time period to really evaluate for each individual child, how did that go for them? How did the format work? And then what was their progress? Because we want to ensure that we're making sure that current and any new disability related needs are addressed. And what you see on your screen is more a major task and leadership timeline of how we're kind of organizing our boulders of work. So this summer, to the greatest extent possible, we're trying to complete initial special education evaluations for early childhood to keep those processes going. We're looking at the beginning of the school year to really be a critical time to reconnect with our children and families and help them reestablish routines, structure, and relationships, again, whether that's virtual or in person. As we move into the fall, we'll be starting to collect that data on student progress. And then in November and December at the latest, start to reconvene those IEP teams to really collaborate with families on designing service moving forward to ensure that each individual student has an IEP that's tailored to their current disability-related needs. And then finally, an area at the heart of all of our work and an area that's really getting a lot of attention in education circles. And as Dan mentioned, really medical communities such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, they're really beginning to emphasize that for all students, attention to their social and emotional needs coming back is going to be at the heart of our work. School closure was challenging for everybody to some degree. And so we're going to make sure that adults are supported and that our return to school, whether it's virtually or in person or a combination of both, is really focused on helping children, student to student and students to adults, reestablish positive relationships, build community among each other, and start by attending to social and emotional needs as well as teaching skills. And we have a number of resources in the district, such as Second Step, to support students and staff, and also our PBIS system. So we're really going to have to spend a lot of time kind of reestablishing those routines and structures, because us doing that well is going to be really critical to doing the academic piece that John was talking about earlier, critical to us being able to do that piece well. And so this is really at the heart of our return to school work, is really attending to everyone's social and emotional needs and reconnecting and creating community in our schools.
So in 28 or so short slides, you represent the work that occurred between March 13th and July 20th, and it alludes to all the work that's yet to come, right? Had there been more certainty regarding the path we could go down, right, we would have been able to focus all of our energy into a lane, and that would have made a lot of people's lives a lot easier, right? But instead, what you have is you have to be ready to go back between March 13th and July 20th, and you have to be ready to support virtual, right, or our quarantines or the changes we're going to face. So we had to design these two lanes at the same time. Neither one of them is finished yet, right? There's a ton of work that has to occur between now and the first day of school on either/both of those lanes. And as of July 20th, the snapshot in time, this is where we find ourselves today, having covered a lot of ground, knowing there's a lot of ground to cover, understanding what a lot of the big rocks are, but responding and reacting to information that we're learning day to day, right? And engaging more deeply in information that we have pieces of, snapshots of, that is changing, right? I've said 4 times during this presentation that the survey that closed July 6th, right, people have altered their opinions since then. I know because I've talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of parents and staff on that subject, right? So what you see before you is quite the journey we've been on. And we know we're not even at halftime, right? We're not even close. There's a lot of long days and hard work left. Before I kind of stop rambling, right, which I've been doing for 58 plus minutes now, if you're counting, I want to add some of the questions we know we're going to get already to prevent us from having to go over that ground a couple of times. So if you can stick with me for just a little bit longer here, like I have some stuff that we know we're going to have to answer, right, in a succinct way that I can include with the executive summary of this presentation, like I said at the outset, to our families this evening. So number one, right, will OCFSD school buildings be open in the fall for in-person instruction? It's a number one question, right? So how we've answered this on July 20th is, as of today, OCFSD is planning to return to school in person 5 days a week with specific health and safety practices and guidelines in place. OCFSD is also planning improvements to temporary remote learning in the event of closure or quarantine, right? So 2 lanes, right? I'm reluctant to send my child to school without a vaccine. Like, what are my options? Right? I've had that conversation with countless parents, as have other people in this building, right? At this time, OCFSD is working on a plan to provide virtual learning options for students and families with underlying health conditions. I talked about this earlier. We have to understand how many students that is so we can tailor our response to those numbers. It'll be different from virtual learning we experienced in the fall and will likely require some criteria and committing for a period of time. More information on applying for the virtual learning option through OCFSD will be shared in a future communication. So that's what we know on July 20th, but there's a lot of work left on that one, right? A lot of these are going to have to be amended and updated, perhaps right up until the first day of school, right? What's the plan for instruction in the event individual classrooms, grades, or schools are required to close temporarily or quarantine? Right. So in the event individual classrooms, grade levels, or an entire school are ordered to quarantine or close by the Oak Creek Health Department, daily instruction will temporarily shift to a remote learning structure led by your child's classroom teacher. This will entail a blended approach of both self-paced, John said asynchronous, and real-time synchronous instruction and learning opportunities. What will temporary remote learning look like? How will it be different than spring 2020? Like my virtual experience in spring, how will this be different, right? John hit this in the slide for you, but for people at home who just have that one question, right? In the event individual classrooms, grade levels, entire schools are ordered to close or quarantine, like I said before, the shift. And I highlight those high points John hit in his slide. Personal protective equipment, right? Will students and staff be required to wear face coverings? I've alluded to that a couple of times. As it stands today, our language says strongly encourage. However, we could revisit that as a team. Will teachers be provided with the necessary PPE? Like I said in the presentation, we have supplies of the necessary PPE available for those staff who need it. What about masks for unprepared students or students who might want one but don't have one? Like I said, thousands of masks procured. Right? How will social distancing work in classrooms with limited space? The placement of student desks and tables, along with in-class instructional groupings of students, will be evaluated by classroom teachers in order to maintain physical distancing among students to the greatest extent possible. When adequate distancing between students becomes challenging, masks may be required. Cleaning and disinfecting, sanitizing. What cleaning and disinfecting plans and protocols will be in place? What I do is succinctly highlight what was in the B&G slide regarding disinfecting. Right, so Steve took some time and labored over those answers. We also make special mention of custodial staff focusing on high-touch areas throughout the building during the course of the day. And we list those ready high-touch areas that were hit in that presentation. How will you clean shared materials and supplies like computers throughout the day? We talk to a degree about what we alluded to in the presentation regarding supplies stocked in classrooms, specific disinfectant supplied by our B&G team to each building or each classroom in every building throughout the whole district. There's a whole section in here on health protocols that Assistant Superintendent Katarik went through a few minutes ago. Everything from what happens to students who are sent to the nurse with fevers or other COVID-19 symptoms, We succinctly review the health room, the alternative health room area, the working to get people home timely, injuries that are different from flu-like symptoms or COVID symptoms, if possible, being dealt with in a different space, right? If a student comes down with a fever, will they be required to get tested for COVID-19? Right? Parents should keep students with any symptoms of influenza-like illness or COVID-19 home from school and contact their primary care physician regarding a need for COVID-19 testing and or self-quarantine. The student should remain at home until symptoms subside. If the child tests positive, the parent or guardian should contact the school principal and the Oak Creek Health Department, like we said in the presentation. We talk about monitoring, or home monitoring, like Assistant Superintendent Katarik reviewed during the presentation. We talk about how we use our nurses throughout the district. Right? District employs 2 full-time school nurses. Annual training held prior to the start of the school year for health room aides, front office staff, and backup support staff. During this training, the nurses will reinforce the delegating of certain duties such as medication administration, rescue procedures, first responder training, and well child protocols. So we talk about some of the essential tasks that our nurses provide for us. We have a section here on notification, which was discussed already in the presentation, right? And it goes on. Student services elements that were hit on those last 2 sides before this closing slide, and notes about transportation that we've gone over twice now, right? So that gets us over 20 of the most frequently asked questions right out of the gate. And I imagine this will grow exponentially starting tomorrow, right? And we'll have to add to it frequently as we go forward. All right. So we've been talking here at you basically for an hour and 5 minutes and covered a tremendous amount of ground. And I think we've done a good job of representing a lot of work that's occurred between mid-March and mid-July. Okay. So now those are the slides. That's the starting FAQ, and that's the primer right here for the summary of this presentation. Okay. That's all the presentation materials I have for you. So I'm going to stop talking for a second. Okay. Okay.
So I'll ask the first question, if that's okay. Is your plan to send out this summary in addition to the PowerPoint presentation or just the summary?
So I don't think the PowerPoint presentation tells the story, right? Like a lot of it has single bullet points on it, and it raises a ton of questions, a lot more than it would answer for people in front of them, right? So what I would send this evening is that opening section that I shared at the outset of the meeting, plus there are small digestible summaries of the various sections that were gone through here. And I'm very clear that this is a July 20th document, right? So a small section on each of the elements that was hit, no PowerPoint.
Could you allude in that possibly that there was a PowerPoint with discussion that will be posted online so that people could at least go and see it and then they get the conversation with the bullet points?
I had not anticipated like writing this as a companion document to the PowerPoint. Like I think they're completely different documents. So if you're going through these slides, right, you saw the elements on the slide. It was done presentation style, right? If you didn't have me or Bridget or John talking through the slides, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But this, on the other hand, is a standalone document. Like if you have this in front of you, like the whole story is here, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Versus watching 2 hours of tape, not being able to understand every word that was said, not knowing who was speaking, who's sneezing, listening to me take giant deep breaths while other people are presenting. So standalone document.
Okay.
Hey, Dan, Mrs. Katar, a question. We kind of really quickly went over.
Can't hear you.
Hey, Maya. Hold on. I don't know why it's not going on.
I can hear you. There's just a lot of feedback.
Can you hear me now?
You're like, you have echo.
Huh? Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I just question for you is special needs. We kind of went really quickly over that. I'm just more curious on how and the why behind it. How is that going to look? I mean, obviously, and what kind of attention and especially when it comes to like wearing masks and how that education is going to look like and social distancing. I can imagine the amount of tension, amount of questions that parents are going to ask about that. That I'm curious. I'm hoping that I know that we've been doing a special newsletter, and there was a committee that they're working with, and I'm hoping we're collaborating with those parents because they can add a lot of feedback before we open beginning of the year of do we need additional equipment? Do we need additional, whatever, whatever they're, that they might need. I'm just wondering because when we did this just now, it was really quick, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just hoping that you can explain more, or maybe a separate document that was going to go out to all the special needs parents with some feedback for them, because that's going to be a whole different, to me, that's a whole different, obviously, subject that needs to be addressed.
Right. I think you're right. I think how we serve our children with disabilities could be a board meeting in and of itself and a very important topic. And we did go through it quickly. And we do plan for subsequent communications to families. I think an important thing as we collaborate with individual families, a key question for those IEP teams to ask the parents is what worked during the spring. And that's a great starting place. So when we went virtual, what worked well for your child? Because some students did thrive, and what didn't work so well, and really build on that. So it's an assets-based approach for that child. And some of those key questions for the IEP team are going to be what you just mentioned. What is there additional equipment needed for your child? Certainly, we're planning for additional safety equipment for staff who might be working in person with children with disabilities, because there are going to be some students for whom they cannot wear a mask. And so that's an example where we want to make sure that our staff are equipped with appropriate type of equipment to ensure their safety. But I think the planning for the child to have a really good experience comes down to working individually with that family or guardian to ensure that their voice is a part of that process. And so future communications will be broad communications globally to all parents of children with disabilities of here's how we're approaching the year, and then down to smaller groups from there down to the most important piece, which is that child's team working individually with that child's family to ensure that there's a successful experience and that we don't repeat anything that didn't work well for them in the fall.
And that'll be virtually and in person on both of those. You'll have that communication.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll probably be having IEP meetings virtually this fall, probably to maintain physical distancing and safety. But whether a child is receiving services virtually or in person, we'll make sure that those individualized needs are met for sure.
Frank, I'll say too, I toggled back to the transportation slide just to make one point too. Like when Bridget said we could probably talk 2-hour board meeting just on that subject, right? That's true of almost all of these topics, right? So if you remember the transportation plan protocol letter that went out, it's a 2-page letter, bullet points, right? Highlighting this, right? And behind each one of these was all of that stuff. So Bridget did a nice job of succinctly explaining like what lives behind some of these bullet points, but I'll just emphasize for the room that there's voluminous information that lives behind each one of these, like that we're all going to have to like work our way through, and school and site-based teams are going to have to do that too. There's no way around it. So
yeah, and Dr. Genneman and the special ed team has been working diligently to organize some of those strategic steps, including communication with families. So as you interface with different families in the community with IEPs, please reassure them that they will hear many more details from our department. We really wanted to have this first conversation with you as a Board of Education before we got too far down that path in communicating more details to families.
All right. Thank you.
And I have 2 questions just initially. One is, we talked about kind of the 2 options, all in back to school or times of remote learning. And then you had that column kind of to the side that was individuals that might have family health concerns, things like that. I know there are some other districts that category includes providing a doctor's note that there are health concerns. If we have families who technically have no health concerns other than this is COVID and I don't feel comfortable sending my kids to school, can they fall into that? District decides that we will go back in person. Can families opt into the I'd like my child to do all virtual learning?
So I think, to answer your question in a roundabout way, it's going to be really important that we know who those people are in greater detail than we knew at this point in time, right? Because I'll say
it was 4% at some point, and
right,
if it's going to be,
I wanted to go to the call the question though. So, all right, when school buildings physically reopen, how comfortable will you be sending your child back to school, right? Very little information, very little context, not having seen any of these communications that we've sent out earlier in the year, right? And none of the subsequent ones, right? So
Right.
who is that 4%, right? And like I said before, like if we contract with a service provider for a finite group of students, that's much easier for us to like logistically and financially manage. But if we have a very large number of families who want to exercise that you describe, like we're going to have to look at this a very different way, right? So to describe this as a complete plan, like you're describing from somewhere else, where maybe you do these things, you get this. Like I'm certain those other districts are evaluating those options, if you want to use that term, like right now, like just like we're going to have to. Like we need to know what these numbers look like today. If it's a small manageable group, like 4% in the district of 6,500 kids, that isn't nothing. But it's a group we can figure out how to manage in a much easier way than if it's 25% or 35%. That changes things, and it will change like how we're going to have to set up the service model, right? So there's not a lot of time to lose in figuring that out. Like it's July 20th, right? So this week
Right.
is about this point in time, right? And a couple other issues that are going to unfold in the next couple of days, but we don't have a minute to sit on our hands. Like this stuff is all going to have to unfold pretty quickly, right? So I can't definitively answer your question. Like you get this roundabout politician's answer from me, but the fact is we don't have enough information to like make a defined decision right now, and we have to get that information pretty darn quick.
When do we plan to get that information?
So we've been talking about it today, right? And we're going to have to get that information out pretty darn soon, a couple of days. I'm not going to give you a date today because I'm not done with the questions. The team hasn't looked around this, but like we don't have a month to plan this. So
Was the question? I didn't hear the question.
So
What was the
Jane
question?
wanted to know if the program that we have here that talks about students with underlying health conditions becoming a part of the 100%
Right.
virtual option.
No, I did. Leah asked the question.
Leah-
I heard that.
Leah wanted to know when we're going to have enough information to make a definitive decision. I
Get the
wouldn't give her a
survey
date.
or
I said we don't have 30 days to spare to work on this. It's going to happen
Right.
a lot quicker than that, right? So I hedged.
And my guess is as well, at some point, you'll have to have some type of a commitment. You can't have 50% of families saying we are not sending them back to school and we plan for that. And then 2 weeks in, they say we want to send them back to school. There'll have to be
Right.
like you said, for a defined period of time, people may need to commit to something.
So
then,
a big group, right? A big group or small, right? So there's a financial outlay, there's a staffing outlay. Like if it's a large group, but not a group so large that it dictates our entire plan process, right? You need to allocate existing staff to a program like that. So we have to know, right? And if it's a small group, that's different because there's a financial outlay that comes out of our budget in a very different way, right? So yeah, yes.
And the second question I just had was in the elementary schools where we're trying to keep kids together more, if you have a teacher who tests positive for COVID, it becomes a little bit easier to say these 30 kids may need to be remote for a bit and they're all working on the same things. Where are we at in planning at a high school level? If you have a teacher that tests positive, they may have 30 kids in 6 different classes throughout the day that then all have other classes as well. It's a bigger spider web. Who and when, I guess, are kind of making some decisions on how that would happen. Would it be every student that touches base with that teacher goes virtual for a period of time? We'll all have different schedules.
So Jane's alluding to something very important here, right? That there's a lot of kids that, like, I was a high school teacher myself. Like, you're in contact with a lot of kids in a given day in a traditional environment like ours is, right? Things get harder the older kids get. Like, that's very clear. And the contract tracing web that you're talking about gets very complicated very fast, right? And I'll just be clear, like, our ability to group a cohort together, keep them together, right, and maintain some of the stuff we're talking about diminishes as a kid ages, right? That's obvious to anybody paying attention, and to tell you otherwise would be a bald-faced lie. So this gets more complicated, like, as the kids get into high school, right? Our middle schools are grouped together in a different way than the high school. High school's got a very traditional model, right? So we have a lot more work to do in terms of how this could potentially be successful at a high school level, right? Given all those complications and given increasing numbers of COVID in the community. So there is not a definitive answer for you today. There is not a settled question of how do you group kids together at that high school. That's probably one of the biggest rocks we have. And as somebody who used to work there and has a special, like, place in his heart for that building and cares very deeply for, that's not an easy question, Jane.
Okay.
It's a big question.
Quick, cleaning and
hear you, Dan.
disinfecting here at High Craft. You meant,
Can't hear you.
come on.
I can hear you, but very faintly.
Okay, hang on. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Kind of going off and on.
Okay, I'm just talking about. Oh, don't worry.
Raise the volume.
Can you hear me now? Better. There we go.
Okay, well,
Cleaning and
there's
disinfecting High
nothing.
Craft.
Well, he's getting set up. I think I'll jump in first. First, I want to say I think you guys have done, the administrative team has done a phenomenal job on all of this. I didn't really know what to expect coming in here, but you've really touched on a lot of the bases. We don't know all the answers yet, and I think that's apparently very apparent here. But it seems like you have very good plans for how you're going to combat this. So I appreciate that, and so I appreciate all your hard work. So thank you. My question is there maybe going to be a separate FAQ for staff? Because I think they have questions related to things like quarantine, that the cleaning things, like, I know we're talking about, and this makes sense to put supplies in the room that changes so we don't have so many people in the office. That makes sense. I'm seeing, okay, that's another thing that's going to distract the teacher from doing what he or she needs to do. So how are we going to accommodate for that, or at least acknowledge that?
Yeah.
That's very important. And something special.
No, I'm really glad you asked, because I had it in my notes here too. So the family FAQ, right, is absolutely critical for tonight's communication, right? And for all the questions that were going to be generated based on this summary document right here, right? So tonight, summary of the presentation document, link to the FAQ, button for the FAQ. Like, that's pretty sound, right? But what about staff, right? So we have roughly 1,000 people that are employed in this district. We've worked with 400 plus who were in during that period between March 13th and now. A lot of support staff, district office staff, administrative staff, front office secretaries, custodial B and G, who have been here day to day throughout this entire period of time. So of questions, a lot asked and answered through that employee group that are going to be asked and have to be answered again for the teacher group, right? So we already have a pretty large volume of questions that we've kind of been stocked with, kind of like how the family FAQ is filled with questions we know people are going to ask right out of the gate, right? So that said, later this week, right, there's going to be subsequent principal communications with their staff, right, that asks for broader collective input and problem solving around a ton of this stuff that we've dropped here. It says right in there that we don't have a lot of PD contracted days in the months of July and August, sometimes not any at all, but it doesn't matter. Like, the crisis is so big, we're going to have to like pivot with how we do professional development, like we talked about when John was speaking, and get going on this a little sooner than we might normally get going on that. Within those communications, and during this week, I anticipate some information from Human Resources, including the beginning of the FAQ and the ability to ask continuous questions. I'll reference like it seems almost irrelevant today that I used to spend a lot of time worrying about, and that's educator effectiveness, right? One tool that we used to communicate, 460 educators on that platform was the digital shared FAQ that we curated and added to in real time. Otherwise, you have the situation where everybody's asking questions, a lot of times very similar questions in similar ways. You know as well as anyone that the bandwidth of everybody around here is taxed as it can possibly be, right? So the FAQ is a self-serving tool because you get to provide a consistent answer to people like when they need it, when they're ready to view it, but it's also an extremely effective tool for making sure everybody's on the same page, right? So staff FAQ, yes, absolutely. This week, if humanly possible, with principal communications to their full staff this week, if humanly possible, and communication from Human Resources in my office. So like a message from me tonight talking about this as well. So staff are going to get, by my count, that's at least 3 things sent from some administrative group soliciting or offering ways to ask questions, add input, or participate in some of these myriad challenges that are laid out in front of all of us. So thank you for that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Can you hear me? No.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Just really loudly, please.
Okay, I was just wondering about the cleaning and disinfecting. You touch on that a little bit about the schools, the water bubblers, the drinking fountains. Is it necessary to have them on? Can we like have them bring their own water jug or supply them water? Because that's going to be a high traffic area, my personal.
Right. So water fountains are definitely a high traffic area, and whether or not students are using them as frequently as they did historically, we're going to clean them more frequently, right? But also the bringing of your own water, right, or bottle filling stations that we have in some schools, those might be more appropriate time being, right? So that's actually something the principals brought up, and I'm sure teachers are thinking about too. Like, it's different. You walk into a classroom, everybody's got their water or whatever, right? It's a good point you make, and one that B&G's thought about.
Dan, can I add one thing to that, please?
Please, Andy.
So we are investigating having bottle fillers at all of our buildings. And so all of our buildings will at least have 1 to 2 bottle fillers. It is an expensive outlay, though, to put them on all of our bubblers, but we have to assume that we're going to get some students who come without a water bottle during the day, and to not have any water source for them from the time school starts till school ends other than an 8-ounce milk is an unreasonable request of a student as well. And so to completely shut them off entirely is something that I'm not comfortable with, but we just have to be conscious that we're going to have students that use them, so make sure that we disinfect them as much as we possibly can, among the other things the custodians are doing.
Yeah, and then 2 more things. I know you said that you want the parents to check the kids and stuff before they come into school. Is there any possible way that we can have staff take the temperatures of each? You don't even have 5 or 10 thermometers at each school, and have them come in different to certified last name or something, and at least have them take the temperature before they come into school. Because some kids can say, "I feel fine, I feel fine." They have 101.1 temperature. They should be in that school. Even the staff also, they come in temperature. Just hey, they came in at 98.0 degree temperature, and then students came in at 98. You get 1 or 2 that have that over 101. At least you can say, "Hey, whoa, this one's." I know it's a lot of work to do in the beginning, but once it becomes routine, I think it'll work a lot smoother as the days progress. Just an opinion.
Okay. So we spent some time thinking about that and trying to evaluate that question too, Darren. And my mind often goes back to like my experience in the classroom. And I've said before when we've talked about like drills, for example, that we evacuate that high school in 5.5 minutes, and it's 6 times larger than the town I grew up in, right? So imagine 2,000 kids, like having a temperature screening, the clustering that would occur inside on the way in, right? The logistical challenge that presents. Like we had to kind of pare down from that a little bit and talk about how could we make it very, very easy for a family like to conduct that at home before they drop their kid off, because 6,600 kids a day coming into our building, right? And we also were advised by local health departments, staff council, a couple other groups that talked about logistically how to do this. Like picture in your head like some sort of placard that you can put on every refrigerator in Oak Creek.
I work at the
right?
VA, so I understand the system, the process,
Right.
how it works.
Right.
How to line
So
back
you
up.
ask a really good question.
Maybe we can do
And the
this.
number of thermometers and stuff that we have, we're going to deploy throughout the district in the health rooms and in the satellite health rooms, right? So logistically, we spent a lot of time talking about that, and we arrived at a place where we couldn't feasibly screen every student upon entry every day. Like logistically, we just can't do it.
I mean, Dan, I
Okay,
just
and one last
did the
question.
math quickly. If you spent 5 seconds on every child in a high school of 2,000 kids, it would take 166 minutes to screen every kid coming in. Granted, that's with one person doing it, but still, that's
Right. No.
Right,
I
but
mean,
even
I
to-
don't. I
even
mean,
to-
on this issue, you make
the time's not
point
there.
is even if we used every door, right, had the staff to do it at every
Right.
door, right, logistically, you get the point I'm making. So it's
Yeah.
a good question. One we talked about, right, also.
And one last question I got: students don't have left to take a Chromebook home. They have no knowledge of computer skills. Their parents have no knowledge of computer skills. How do they get that training to be able to sign on to do the virtual learning? They may not have no skills at all with the computer. If you understand what I'm saying, a first grader or whatever grade that opted out to come to school and they want to do virtual learning, someone has to teach that family how to sign on and get onto that classroom site. Does that not make sense? You can hold classes for that kind of stuff.
I'm going to ask
prior to
Mr.
school
Krennick,
starting?
if he could, to talk about our ability of families to log on and interact with the devices, the lesson we learned from the spring on that subject, right? So like I'll ask John to tell you a little bit about how that experience went for folks and how students were able to interact. If you could interject, John, I'd appreciate that.
No problem. Can everybody hear me? So through the presentation, when we get back in the fall, one of the first things we're going to do besides implementing social and emotional learning and reconnecting and building relationships with students is teaching students how to access online learning or remote learning when we have to, if and when we have to pivot to that. So teachers will be trained between now and the end of August through our Google modules and how to train students to get logged on the Chromebook, how to access them. And in some cases, this past spring, we had to make home visits to help students get logged on and support families and show families and students how to use the Chromebooks or a hotspot, because there are some families that do not have internet, and we had to provide hotspots and show them how to do that.
Darren, I just want to make this point too. Like earlier in the presentation, I was talking about like the service center that our IT department manned.
Yes.
Like I can't tell you the number of hours that group spent on the phone with people, like just managing stuff. No. You're asking a good question, and I'm telling you how we answered it. Like in the spring, like we walked a lot of people through individually who had those very same hurdles you identify. So when John talks about them doing it, like somebody calls in, says, I'm having trouble with this. Like our team, like painstakingly walked people through that process of doing it, providing that support. So like we're fully aware of the fact that there's a real good chance we're going to have to spend a fair bit of time, like doing what John's talking about in terms of preparing people and also troubleshooting individual issues one-on-one. It's a tremendous amount of time and energy, but if you can't interact with your Chromebook or your iPad, it's not going to work. So
that was my thing. Chromebooks from 1 to 12, K4, iPads. They may never seen an iPad before. It's not like a tablet. It's totally different. It's like book, I should say. It's a different animal there. Everything reversed on there. They're used to like a laptop or a Chromebook. They go to an iPad at 4 years old. That's totally different.
Fair enough.
Back. All right, thank you.
Dan, if I could, I just, I know there's a lot of work that's gone into this, and there's a lot of work that still has to be done. You know, I'm one of those parents that a couple weeks ago filled out the survey, and I said, send them back to school 100%. But now that this last couple weeks, my family has been affected by this, and I've seen an increase at my work and at my family's work of the direct exposure and the quarantining that goes into this. I'm one of those parents that has changed their opinion. And I just wonder what the deciding factor is going to be that's going to determine whether or not we are in school or not in school. And if we're not going to be in school, why aren't we just planning that right now from the get-go for the first quarter?
All right, so you ask a question that's on the mind of a lot of folks, right? So it's a couple part question, if I could cut it apart like delicately here, right? So I've talked a couple times about needing to know whose opinion has changed, right? And I feel like there's probably plenty of folks who would express a very similar opinion to the one you've advanced right now, and staff too, right? So we need to know that. And in terms of like giving you a definitive number, like if we survey and a number crosses a certain threshold, right? Like that gets very complicated very quick. It calls into question like our partnership with the health department, recommendations we've been giving, board action, right? Whether or not we as a group would feel collectively comfortable and willing to engage in this along those lines, right? And what we can know today versus what we'll know in 5 days or 10 days, right? So I don't have a good answer for you on July 20th in terms of what trips the trigger for this switch, but I do know we need more information. I do know things could change. I do know this plan says 5 days, but we're exploring an entire parallel line that would serve as a virtual return to school. I know that all the professional development and staff development, all the work we're planning to do supports virtual, right? So I know that we're preparing for that possibility as heavily as we're preparing for a return to school, right? So it's not a clear if we get to 40% answer. I can't give you that at this moment. And I don't think you're asking me to do that either. I think the clearest, most honest answer I can provide tonight at 7:35 on July 20th is we need to know, right, how opinions have shifted, and we're going to have to talk about this some more, right? I've told a couple of staff members that this issue is not settled tonight, right? Like you can't definitively plan your life around what we're saying right now, right? But we don't have all the time in the world either. And I have a feeling that a lot of discussions like this are being had or will be had in the very near term. Like I know that we're going to continue working with the health department, and I know the numbers are rising in our community and neighboring communities, right? So this isn't over, not by a long shot, right? I imagine we'll have more work study or emergency board meetings on the subject, and the pressure is just going to continue to build as we get closer to the first day of school. And I realize that families plan their lives around the decisions we make right now. Like I'm in the same situation with 3 kids myself and a working spouse. Like people are relying on us to make a good choice, and the more timely we can make that choice, the better. Right. And you heard us talking about unanswered questions for the high school in particular, right? That weighs heavily on everybody's mind. And there's no other way to say that than just to state it frankly, right? Like the things that we know we're capable of at the elementary level look different at the middle level, look different at the high school level, right? So we're not done, not by a long shot.
Yeah, the other thing we didn't talk about was the traveling teachers too. There's so many teachers that travel between schools, and there's just so many factors that the more I talk about it, the more I think about it, the more I just feel like we should be leaning towards virtual, at least to start the quarter. And my daughter would hate me knowing that I said that, but I just have seen that increase in prevalence. I've seen it in my work. I've seen it in our community. I've had to talk to the health department myself, and it's not a fun situation to be in, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, and I certainly don't wish it on our students or our staff.
Well, Dan, if I may. I'm sorry. I was just going to say it's important that tonight we're talking about 5 days a week return to school, but we could very well have been talking about virtual school as where we're going to start. But at some are going to come back into the building, whether that's the first day of school, whether that's October 1st, December 1st. At some point, they're going to come back. So when we think about all the operational things we're talking about, those are going to have to be in place regardless if it's September 1st or December 1st. When we talk about bringing students back, at some point we could bring them back and very easily have to flip into a virtual school because the virus changes itself and mutates itself again. So all of the things that we're talking about tonight and planning for are not going to go to vain. They're all going to be implemented, whether it's September 1st or at some future date down the road.
Yeah.
And so we still have to go through all of these steps between now and then anyway. So it's important for us to continue to go through the steps and walk through all the processes. So when that day comes, we are prepared with as many scenarios and as many topics as we can possibly be in order to provide the best education for our kids, which we know is in the classroom. Maybe not September 1, as some have alluded to, but in the classroom is the best education that they can get. And so we have to figure out how do we do that at the most appropriate time and plan for that inevitability to be back in the classroom at some point.
It's a good point. Like all this energy for a 5-day return, whether it's September 1 or some other date, like will not have been done in vain, because at some point we're going to open those doors, September 1st or another day. Right. So thank you, Andy.
Yeah, Andy, thank you. That's a really
I got one more.
good perspective.
Talking. Oh.
My mic's not on?
I can hear you.
All right, well, she's waiting for her.
I can hear you.
You're on. Oh, okay. My question is a sort of a follow-up to Amy's question, because I feel like my angle of it is a little different. Your idea that what is being asked is, at what point is the social pressure enough for us to decide to go virtual is a little different than
I don't know if that's exactly my position.
What is the level of disease that is thing that flips us? Has the health department provided any information about what they see being too much in our community for schools to open, where the risk gets too high?
No.
And isn't that strange? I find
so
that
I would.
We have no indication of what level of disease is too high for schools.
Leah, I would call it strange if there was definitive answers elsewhere. Right? Like I would refer to it as strange locally if I could cross a road and get that definitive answer. Then I'd feel like it's strange. But honestly, I feel like it is absolutely fitting with what we have been tasked with in this nation, right? Like this is a local control issue and nobody's making choices and giving us definitive benchmarks like a couple of you have alluded to, right? So strange, no. Difficult, beyond difficult.
Fair.
Yeah.
Very fair. Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea that everything the idea that you guys, the administration, the team who has put the most time and effort into making this, multi-stimulus plan, that this is happening all over the country is outrageous in its waste of energy. Because if we had somebody giving us some indication of what is expected, then we could do an amazing job at whatever we did. And I'm sure we still will, because of the sheer amount of effort that I see being put in this to make this okay. But I can't help but see this huge amount of effort and think, wow, wouldn't it be better spent on making a decision now and then? But to Andy's point, like Andy makes a good point. We're going to have to for school to open. We're going to have to plan for virtual anyway. But is there a way to adjust the timing of those decisions such that it's a more palatable expectation? But I realize that's not up to you, and that's not up to us at this point. We're in it.
It's a fair point, and I'll share personally. Like I have people, this, basically living in this office, and the only thing that has comforted me throughout all of this is there's never been a choice. Right? Like work the problem, because there aren't definitives like you alluded to before. Like the only thing that I can say to myself when I wake up in the middle of the night or come in here before the sun's up and other people are already here working when I get here is that there was no other option. There was no other way except to plan very pragmatically for all these different things that we're laying out here tonight. So
there was another way. If it
Not
was
available.
provided to
One not available to us, right? Like I get what you're saying. Yep.
um, to follow up on my question about, sure. No, quite all right. My other question that is kind of related to the what is the level of disease is um, I'm so thankful to those of you who have really created this close relationship with our health department, and I'm so thankful to our health department, if you're listening, for all of the work that you've done to contribute to making our schools a potentially safe place to well, giving us a path forward, I guess I'll say. My question though is kind of for
I was
both the health
I
department
was waiting
and
to
the
talk when she
is
gets done,
what
so
is the plan
I was gonna leave it
for
open.
communicating the quarantines and or positives that happen in our district beyond just the people who are immediately affected? And the reason that I bring that up as an important point is I feel like if it's too easy for people to feel like we're not being transparent about the risks that sending their kids to our programs present if they're not aware of the level of positive cases or kids in quarantine that we have already had or that we likely will have in the future. Do we have a plan beyond the health department sending a letter to the kids in quarantine? Is it possible that in addition to our FAQ on our COVID-19 page, we have some kind of counter like they have at the hospital?
I'll say this. I think the specific place where this question comes from relates to some of our summer programming, right? And we were relying on the health department for communication, but we've learned that that's not going to do it. Like we were talking about this a couple hours ago, how subsequent communication from us is going to have to be essential too. So it's like we're learning in real time, like what needs to happen, how it needs to happen, how quickly it needs to happen. I've talked about Mrs. Ryan and Mr. Holler having already opened their schools, right? So they've lived through what we're living through right now on a different scale, right? And that point you're making right now is a lesson we've learned like in the last 72 hours about the expectation of communication around exposure in specific programs that we're going to be held to account for that nobody's ever experienced before, right? So I think 6 hours ago, I greenlighted a different kind of communication that comes from us versus just through the health department, through Mr. Holler, for example. And that has to like extend through some of our practices for next year too, because people are very much on edge and that's not going to change in the days right in front of us. It's going to get much, much worse in my humble opinion. So your point's well taken, lesson learned, different communication now.
I actually wasn't trying to make a comment on specific
No,
instances going on in school. What I am concerned about myself
Mm.
is, I am also, along with Amy, one of the parents whose family filled out the survey that, yeah, we're sort of on the fence, but if we know that you're going to do your best, and so it's cool. Except we just, while I was reading the last couple of emails that I could read on my way into this meeting, got the news notification from WISN that Wisconsin just had its third record-setting case day in a row. And I know that being in Milwaukee County, chances are that, well, I didn't see this specifically, chances are that, we had a pretty good number of cases in Milwaukee County today. And I am one of the people who also am like really not as comfortable with sending my student to school as I was a month ago. And part of that is probably because I know about some of the risks that are happening in real time in Oak Creek. And I feel like it's really easy for people that have no idea that that's happening to feel differently about the risks that are apparent because they're just not aware. And I think it's partly our job to be transparent about what is happening so that people are making an informed decision when they check that box of how they feel about sending their student to school, despite all the most amazing efforts
Sure.
to make it the safest possible place it can be.
One
We just are not magicians.
One thing I know we've discussed is sharing on the City of Oak Creek homepage, you can tab to like their data dashboard page, which will reflect like a 7.8% positivity rate reflective of today, right? It takes a little bit of decoding to really understand it, but there's real-time data for our community, so we're talking about that too.
Yeah. I guess for everybody in the room, and maybe you'll take it wrong, but I look at this as if no matter what decision we make with opening the schools, there's risk involved here if we open the schools. I grant everybody that. But that being said, if we're not willing to take any risks at all, then we might as well let the schools closed all year long and go to virtual right away and forget about opening, because if you don't want to take on any risk, as soon as one person gets sick, that's assuming risk, and we should just stay closed. It's kind of a radical way to say it, but if you're not willing to assume some risk with opening the schools, then you might as well not open them at all and just leave them closed all year and go to virtual and forget about it. That being said, I understand I don't have kids in school anymore. And for the people on the board that do have kids in school, that's a personal decision not to send your children to school if you don't want to. But it shouldn't reflect on the 90% or the 89% or whatever a survey would come out that still want to send their kids to school. We shouldn't inflect our personal opinions into how you're going to vote for the whole district. So if you don't want to send your kids to school, if you don't feel comfortable, that's your decision as a parent. You can have them virtual schools at home. But there's a lot of other people in the city that do want to send their kids to school for whatever reason, whether it's family, whether it's financial, whether it's, you're not worried about it, whatever their reasoning is. You shouldn't let your personal situation reflect on how you're going to vote to move forward here. That's the second thing. Third thing is just a suggestion that for staff, because it's kind of a thing where the children are less susceptible of carrying and spreading the disease than adults. And my suggestion would be to require all the teachers to be pre-tested within, a week before school starts, to make sure that everyone comes back negative. So we have a pretty much assurance that all the staff that's in the schools is virus free. And that way we've got a baseline that all the teachers are good. Parents are still responsible for what their students are, especially the grade school kids and the preschool kids. And there was one other thing. I don't think we should look at this as a district issue. It should be a per school issue. It's easier to track a baseline on a per school basis, and say if we have a high rate of COVID in Cedar Hills, are we going to close the whole district down because one school's got a higher rate? Or are we just going to say the people that are in Cedar Hills got to go virtual and the rest of the district can continue on because there's no risk, because there's no infection that has gone to the other schools? And that was kind of the last point I'd like to bring across. If we could do a school by school thing instead of one size fits all, because in my opinion, the federal government and even the state government has missed the boat on a lot of their decisions they've made, because they're basing their decisions on maybe what's happening in the Milwaukee and Madison area, and if they're putting one rule down that is one size fits all, where it goes all the way up to, the smallest county with the least amount of population way up north in Wisconsin, that's got maybe 10,000 people in the whole county. They got one case and they're under the same guidelines as Milwaukee and Madison. So it's not a one size fits all thing. that's why I said maybe we should look at doing a school by school thing. So that's pretty much all I got to say. My 3 or 4 bullet points.
Anybody else have any questions?
I know they're already underway and stuff with the preparation and stuff, but fall sports, are we just gonna play that by ear? You know, with the WIA maybe coming down with something for all across the board fall sports that are sanctioned by WIA, and then what about clubs also that we have, you know, basically
Right. There's a whole separate line of discussion around sports and WIAA and guidance that may or may not be coming out from them. I know that WIAA right now is trying to respond to a great deal of pressure. And I would expect something to come from them sooner or later. And if that doesn't happen, we'll be in a similar situation to what we're examining here tonight, where we're making site-based choices on this. And I know Mr. Holler would be in coordination with the conference at a minimum to start working through that. So more to come on sports. Like I don't know enough, nor is there enough information out to speak with any sort of certainty or finality on sports right now. But that's top of mind, and that's coming too. So
just want to throw it out for people to know.
fair enough. No, sports, fair enough. Yep. So in terms of what's next, right? Because there's all this information laid out there. Like I've alluded to a series of communications, but like to Amy's question earlier, right? This isn't over by a long shot, right? So I update the community on where we are as of the 20th. I update the staff and we engage the staff in subsequent planning around both of these modalities, right? And we get more data regarding how positions may or may not have changed in the last 16 or so days, right? It's going to drive a lot of decisions. So it's going to be a busy week around here. And I would assume we're going to have more work studies or special sessions on this subject, right? It is not going to get quieter in the run up to school. The controversy is not going to quiet down. Like it's going to be, I anticipate the most challenging period for school leadership that any of us have ever experienced between now and the first day of school, and odds are through all of 2021. So more to come, right? One thing you can be certain of is that the communication loop is going to be as strong as it's ever been, because there is no other option right now. We have too many important choices that we're going to have to make in the near term, right? So in terms of this is what we've done so far, this is what we're planning, and this is where we are on this day, right? That was the goal for tonight. Right. So I think we're there in terms of like a great deal of information sharing and getting everybody up to here's where we are on July 20th. Right. But we're not done by a long shot. Fair enough, everybody?
Yep.
Okay. Yes.
Dan,
Yep.
Okay. Dan, Chris, Lisa, everybody involved, John, Andy, thank you for all your hard work on this. We appreciate, I know Cheryl said it earlier, but everybody else, but I know it's a lot of work, it's very fluid, and it moves very quickly, but Quinn, thank you for all your hard work, and we appreciate everything you're doing every day.
To build on what you said, Frank, and I'm going to speak for all of us in the room, the board, and everybody, there's a lot of teaching staff who are deeply engaged in the subjects we're getting into here and are going to be asked to plan some very challenging stuff in the coming days. And this is going to be a Herculean team effort here. And I want to thank the entire district in advance for this work that we have to do. Right? Because like I said before, there aren't options other than walk down all these different roads, monitor the most current information, be willing to pivot when we have to, try to get things to people as soon as we can so they can make important decisions about their life. And by people, I mean all of our staff and all of our families, right? So more to come. Lots more work. And there is no way we accomplish this without everybody being united as a team working together. We have great people in this district, right? We worked our tails off in the spring and we can do better, right? And we're gonna, and that's what we're gonna do right up until the start to school and beyond. So thank you to everyone for the work that's been done and all the hard work that's to come. So thank you, Frank.
Mm-hmm. If there's no other questions, we need a motion to adjourn.
Rakoff seconds.
Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Aye. Thank you for coming.